start. We're going to look into a really cool little discussion here on the Gemara page that we started. Bava Metzia, Nun Aleph, Amud Aleph, 51a. And we've been discussing the laws of Oinah, which is overcharging. And in what circumstances does a buyer or a seller have redress that they can ask for their money back or the money missing when the seller has overcharged or the buyer has underpaid? That's the topic that we've been looking at. And on this topic, the Gemara now goes into a really fascinating discussion. And to understand this and to follow it, you need to utilize your full Talmudic brain, which requires you to remember names and opinions. This is one of the challenges of Gemara study that is very different to most other studies, and that is it requires a huge amount of memory as well as critical thinking. There's just remembering who said what and remembering the logic behind the various arguments. To hold the train of discussion of the Gemara, you need to remember the opinions, who said them. So you're using recall, your memory, but you're also following an argument, a logical argument, which takes various parts of the brain working at the same time. This might be why we feel a slight exhaustion after a few lines of Gemara, because we're using areas of our brain that are not usually used at all, and certainly not used at the same time. Most of the reading we do requires a bit of memory. You can't read anything without remembering what you just read. It won't make any sense. But you're usually not juggling varying opinions or opposing opinions all at once. Whereas in the Talmudic narrative, the discussion, the back and forth, you need to be holding on to all of that. And so this section is no exception to that. It requires holding kop, as they say in Yiddish, holding your head, remembering, keeping a tally of the opinions. And so with Hashem's help, we'll be able to do that. We're on page Nun Aleph, Amud Aleph, 51a, and we have 5 lines from the bottom of the page where the arrow is right there. That's where we're going to go from. The Talmud here says the word itmar. Itmar means it's been said, a teaching has been said amongst the rabbis of the Gemara times, of the Talmudic times in Babylon, the following teaching. Ha'omer lechaveroi, if somebody says to their fellow in the midst of doing some type of sale, transaction, Almanas she'ein lecha alai oinah, I'm doing this sale, I'm selling this to you on condition that you do not have any claim of trickery on me, any claim of being of overpaying on me. Oinah, being overpaid. So I'm making a condition. I'm doing a deal. I'm selling you this watch on condition that you don't come back with a complaint of being overcharged. That's my condition. Can you do that? Are you allowed to do that? We've said until now that in a normal transaction, you can have a claim of being overcharged. If it's 1/6, you can certainly claim back the overcharged amount. If it's more than 1/6 over the retail value, so then you can cancel the entire sale. That's Torah law. But here, the seller is saying, I want to make a condition on the sale. My condition is that you cannot come back to me with any complaint of being overcharged. If you agree to that, it's a deal. If not, no deal. So the question is, if you agree to that, you're the buyer here, and you agree to that, is that condition binding? Does it work? Is a seller allowed to make such a condition? What he's basically saying is, even though the Torah says that you as a buyer have a right to complain that you've been overcharged, I'm asking you to waive that right. That's the condition of this sale. That I'll sell this to you on condition that you waive that right. Otherwise, no sale. If you agree to that, let's say you do agree to that, but is that condition a valid condition in a sale?
So we believe the one who said is a seller at this stage?
Yeah. So what's the basis of this question? What are we trying to get to here? So we know that there's such a thing as making conditions. There's terms and conditions in every sale, and those terms and conditions, we would assume, if the buyer and the seller agree to those terms and conditions, so then it's a deal. Every sale has the small print that's that in the contract. If you agree to the contract, if you sign the contract, you've agreed to the small print, to everything in it. We assume that you read it, considered it, and accepted it. All the times when we have to click, I've read the conditions and I accept, even though we've almost never read those conditions, but we just click it anyway. So the assumption is, well, if you click it, then you've accepted the conditions. So here, the buyer is saying, I'm selling this object to you. The condition is you have no redress. You can't come back and say I overcharged you. You have to accept the sale as it was. You've bought it, no returns. So at first glance, why not? Why shouldn't he be able to do that? If the buyer says that and the seller agrees, of course, if the seller says that and the buyer agrees, if you're the buyer, you might be a little suspicious of like, why is he making this condition? But maybe that's his standard condition. It's not nothing to do with this particular sale. It's a standard condition. That's how I do business. I'm not interested in people coming back with complaints. No returns. Like some businesses have that, no return policy. Or it's a sale item, and on sale items there are no returns. You got to accept it as it is. For whatever reason, that's what he said. If the seller says that and the buyer accepts it, why should we think it's anything wrong? Well, I'll tell you why we should think there's something wrong. And that is that we're getting into territory here that is dealt with elsewhere in the Talmud, and that is making a condition against a Torah law. When you make a condition that contradicts what the Torah says, now you're getting into dangerous territory, because the Torah says that when a sale takes place, there is redress, there is a claim, and you're not allowed to trick and overcharge unfairly. That's a Torah law. Here, the seller is saying, I want to make a condition to override that law. I don't want you to enforce the law of trickery on me. That would seem to be potentially making a condition against what the Torah says, and that you're not allowed to do. Conditions are allowed to be in your own business, but to make a condition that it goes against Torah is not allowed. For example, if somebody employs a fellow Jew and says, but it's on condition that you work on Shabbos. That's the condition. You have the job as long as you work on Shabbos. Working on Shabbos is forbidden. Even if the worker accepts the condition is nullified. You can't make a condition against the words of Torah. You can't make a condition to break the law of Torah. You've already accepted the Torah upon yourself. Every Jewish soul accepted the Torah at Mount Sinai. Whether you were alive at the time or you weren't, your soul was there. We've all accepted the laws of Torah. So you're already bound by the laws of Torah. To make a condition that contradicts a law of Torah is forbidden. It doesn't work. It's nullified. It's empty words. And so here as well, it would seem the same thing, that you're making a condition against what it says in the Torah. How can you do such a thing? On the other hand, we have another principle that says that any condition that is made concerning monetary transactions, that's fine. That you can make any when it comes to a monetary transaction, a financial deal, you can make any condition you want, as far as the finances are concerned, as far as the money is concerned. And so if you decide that that's the condition you want to make, you can make that the condition. It's a financial condition. So the question here is, do we consider this a financial deal? This is just buying and selling. And by saying, I don't want you to have a claim of trickery on me, that's just a detail in the financial deal that we're making. Or do we say, no, this is actually going against the Torah? You're making a condition that the Torah should not apply. You can't make such a condition. This is actually the crux of this question here. When asking, can you make a condition? Can the seller say, my condition is that you can have no claim of trickery against me? So on this question, we of course have two opinions. On the fourth last line here, let's hear what the two opinions are. Rav Amar Yeshloi Alav Ainah. Rav says, the great sage of the Talmud of Babylon called Rav. Rav says, you nevertheless, the buyer nevertheless can make a claim of trickery. Even if he agrees to such a condition, the condition is nullified. You can't make a condition against what the Torah says. You can't say that the laws of Torah don't apply to me. Doesn't work. And so by saying, I'm making a deal with you, I'm selling you this thing, as long as you don't have a law, you don't have a claim of trickery, you're not allowed, you have to waive your right to have the law of trickery, says Rav, does not work. The buyer can buy it. Even if he agreed to the condition is erased. It's nullified. It's meaningless because it's against the words of Torah. The Torah says you do have trickery. You do have a claim. And so therefore, if indeed he was overcharged, he can go back and say, I want my money back. That's what Rav says.
Even if the buyer agreed,
Correct.
That agreement can still be...
The agreement is nullified. The agreement is meaningless because neither the buyer nor the seller has a right to say the laws of Torah don't apply. It's the same as saying that I'm taking the job, but the law of Torah that says you can't work on Shabbos doesn't apply to me. That's meaningless words. It does apply to you. So says Rav, the words are as if they were never said. The sale is a sale. However, if it's overcharged, the buyer can come back and say, I want my money back. I have a claim. And he has a claim, even though the seller says, but we agreed that you don't have that claim. The Beis Din will say in such a case, I'm sorry, that agreement is null and void because you cannot make a condition against what the Torah says. So that was Rav's opinion. But we have a second opinion. Rav's sparring partner in the Talmud is usually Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel. So Shmuel Amar, Shmuel disagrees. Shmuel, the other great sage of Babylon, disagrees with Rav and says, Amar, Ein loy alav ainah. No, if the agreement was made between buyer and seller that you cannot have a claim of overcharging, you can't claim ainah, you can't claim trickery in this case. If the buyer accepted that condition, the condition is binding, and he cannot come back later and say, you overcharged me. I want my money back. No, the agreement works, says Shmuel, which to us at the moment is a bit puzzling because wouldn't we say that this is making a condition against Torah law? It seems that it is, but let's see. Okay, so for now, we have two opinions on the question whether you can make a condition whether the buyer the seller can tell the buyer, I don't want you to have any claim of trickery on me. You have to accept the sale as it is. Even if you later find out you've been overcharged, you have no claim. And the buyer agrees. Rav says, doesn't matter. You can't make a condition against Torah law. The laws of trickery still apply. Shmuel says, no, this works. This condition works. And he cannot have a claim, even if he later finds out that he was overcharged. That is the disagreement between Rav and Shmuel on this opinion. Is that all clear? Yeah. Okay. Now the Talmud says, well, hang on a minute. Rav and Shmuel were two great sages from the Gemara times. The Gemara is the expansion and commentary on the Mishnah. The Gemara was written in around the 4th and 5th century in Babylon as an expansion on the Mishnah, which was written in the 1st, 2nd century in the land of Israel. Sages of the times of the Mishnah are of a higher caliber than the sages of the Gemara because they were earlier authorities. And so therefore, we have a general principle that the sages of the Gemara times can argue with their own contemporaries, like Rav and Shmuel, but they can't argue with people from the previous generation, from the Mishnah generation. That's not their right. They can argue with people of their times, but they can't argue with previous generations, because the previous generations are seen as closer to truth, closer to Mount Sinai. They had it clearer. And so the generations of the Mishnah, their opinions cannot be debated by rabbis of the Gemara. And therefore, if we are to find a clear opinion in the Mishnah generations, so then the rabbis of the Gemara cannot debate such a thing. Or if we find a debate amongst the rabbis of the Mishnah, then that debate would not simply be repeated by rabbis of the Gemara, because that's a previous debate. So it doesn't need to be gone over again. And the Gemara now is going to suggest that this debate between Rav and Shmuel seems to be a rehash of a debate that was held between two rabbis of the Mishnah times, which would be strange for Rav and Shmuel to repeat that debate in the Gemara times. So says the Gemara, Lema, shall we say Rav de Amak Rabbi Meir, that Rav's opinion, who says that if you make a condition that there's no trickery, the condition does not work, you can't make such a condition. Let's say that Rav says exactly like Rabbi Meir from the Mishnah, which we're about to see, Shmuel, who said that you are allowed to make such a condition, it is effective. If you make a condition that the seller says you can have no trickery on me, it works. If the buyer agrees, he can't have a claim. Shmuel de Amak Rabbi Yehuda. It seems that Shmuel's opinion is exactly the same as Rabbi Yehuda from the Mishnah times. In other words, we're about to present a machlokas, a debate between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda that seems to echo exactly the opinions of Rav and Shmuel. But Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda are from the Mishnah times. Rav and Shmuel are from the Gemara times. And so we're going to question why this debate would be repeated if we find it previously. The Tanya, because it says in a brisa. A brisa we've met many times. Anyone remember what a brisa is?
A Torah law.
Sorry?
Is it a Torah law?
Brisa is not a Torah law.
Teaching?
Brisa is a Torah law. Maybe that's what you're thinking.
A teaching?
Specifically, a brisa is a teaching of the rabbis from the same time as the Mishnah, same time period as the Mishnah, but a brisa means literally an outside teaching. It was not included in the Mishnah, either because it's repetitive of something that's found in a Mishnah, but explains more details, or for whatever other reason, but it's from the same time period as the Mishnah. That's what a brisa is, a teaching from the rabbis of the Mishnah that's not included in an actual Mishnah. So the word Tanya means it was taught in a brisa. It was taught in a brisa, and what's the brisa? Let's hear. We're going to go into something seemingly completely different, but we'll see it's actually the same principle as our discussion. Ha'omer li'isha, somebody who's getting married to a woman, getting betrothed, and the laws of betrothal are that a man says to a woman, you're betrothed to me through this ring or through something of value, according to the law of Moses in Israel. But let's say the man, when he's betrothing the woman, he's giving her the ring to be married to her. Ha'omer li'isha, he says, Harei at mekudeshes li, you're betrothed to me. But he puts in a condition. Al manas she'ein lecha alai she'er ksus va'oina. On condition that you can have no claim from me for the three obligations that normally a husband is obligated towards his wife. So his condition is, I'm getting married to you, but the marriage, I'm giving you the ring to be married to you, but the condition is that you cannot ask me to provide for you the three things that a normal husband is obligated to give the wife. And they are she'er, which means food, ksus, which means clothing, va'oina, and oina, which means conjugal rights, intimacy. That generally speaking, the Torah gives a obligation that when a husband marries a wife, it's understood, it's self-understood, that the husband will feed her, give her clothing to wear, and also provide for her conjugal needs, intimacy, sexual intimacy. It's an obligation of the husband and a right of the wife in Jewish law. It's the wife's right and the husband's obligation. These things are today stipulated in the ketubah, in the marriage document, that a husband is obligated to feed, clothe, and provide intimacy to his wife. This husband is saying very romantically to his wife that I'll marry you, but the condition of marriage that you have to accept, if you accept this, then we're married. If not, then we're not married. The condition is, I'm not going to feed you, I'm not going to buy your clothing, and I'm not obligated to give you intimacy. Now, remember, we're learning Talmud here. We're not doing relationships course here, so we're not going to discuss why he's saying this, what type of pathology he has. We're not going to discuss why she would possibly accept such a thing. We're not going into the background here. This is Talmud, where we're talking legal talk. So, in theory, if a husband came and said this to his wife, or a husband to be, he wants to marry her. They're not married yet. He's giving her the ring, but saying on condition that you have no claim for me to feed you, clothe you, or be intimate with you. Even though these three things are Torah obligations. The Torah obligates a husband to do these three things. So, says the Brisa, Harizumu Kodeshes, she's married. If she accepts the ring and accepts the conditions, she's married. Utnoi bottle. And the conditions are nullified, are meaningless. They're erased. She has absolute right to demand food, clothes, and intimacy from him, even though he stipulated, "I'm only marrying you on condition that you have no claim of these things." And she accepted. She accepted the ring, and she accepted. Yeah, they're married, and the condition is nullified, is meaningless. Divrei Rabbi Meir. That's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says you can't make such a condition, because the Torah obligates him with these three things. So it's meaningless. Such a condition is meaningless. And so even though he stated it, she agreed to it, making an agreement that contradicts the Torah is like saying gibberish. It's nothing. It's meaningless. The words are as if they were never said. So the marriage happened. The condition is nullified. So says Rabbi Meir.
Good question. What's the literal translation of oina? Is that like time or something? Or is it actually what you said before?
Literally, yeah, it literally means time together, her times. That's Rabbi Meir's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda, however, says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, B'davar sheb'mamon t'noi kayam. In the areas that are monetary only, the condition stands. Meaning, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says the condition is completely erased. The Torah tells a husband, you get married, you take upon the obligation to feed, clothe, and be intimate with your wife. If you make a condition, I'm not doing that, the condition is meaningless because the Torah tells you have to. That's Rabbi Meir's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and says, no, out of those three obligations, two of them are monetary obligations. To feed and clothe are monetary obligations. You have to pay for her food and pay for her clothing. Intimacy is not a monetary obligation. And so, says Rabbi Yehuda, in the case of the two monetary obligations, the condition stands. If two people make a condition on a monetary financial agreement, that's okay. Even if the Torah obligates somebody monetarily, because it's a financial obligation, you can make an agreement that it doesn't apply to us. As far as intimacy is concerned, Rabbi Yehuda agrees that part of the condition falls away because that's not a monetary agreement, that's physical intimacy. So therefore, that part of the agreement does not stand. He is obligated to be intimate with her, but he is not obligated, says Rabbi Yehuda, to pay for her food and clothing. So what do we get from this fascinating brisa? Somewhat surprising brisa that we didn't think we would hear about. We've got an unusual circumstance where a husband's made a condition that I'm getting married to, well, the husband to be a would-be husband, I'm getting married to you. He says to her, on condition that I'm exempt from the 3 obligations of a husband. I don't have to feed, clothe, and be intimate with you. That's the condition, and she accepts. On that, Reb Meir says they're married, and the condition is out the window. It means nothing because the Torah obligates him with these 3 things. You can't make a condition against the Torah. Rabbi Yehuda says it's true you can't make a condition against the Torah, but that's only true about non-financial things. When it comes to financial agreements, any condition that is agreed upon by the 2 parties is fine. Something that's purely financial, you can agree on it. That's fine. So therefore, the 2 financial obligations of feeding and clothing, he's exempt from. She accepted that condition. He's exempt. When it comes to intimacy, he's not exempt. That condition is nullified, is erased because that's not a financial agreement. It's a personal, interpersonal, intimate agreement, and therefore the Torah obligation stands despite the condition they made.
So, Rabbi Mas, in both cases, the marriage goes ahead. But
Both agree. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi agree that the marriage goes ahead.
Correct, but
The question is which part of whether the condition is standing. Rabbi Meir says no condition at all. The condition's out the window because it's against the Torah. Rabbi Yehuda says no, the condition works for 2 out of the 3 because that's financial. Okay?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
does Reb Meir give his reasoning why financial is permissible?
Not here, but generally the reasoning is that Torah, when it comes to Torah law, Torah obligations, so we can't say anything. When it comes to financial things, my money is my money. If I want to give up my money, I can do that. Like I can do that. If you owe me money, the Torah says you have to pay your debt, right? Can I forgive your debt? Of course I can. So even though the Torah says you must pay your debts, but if you owe me money and the Torah says you must pay your debt, can I not say, I forgive the debt? I can. It's my money. I can do whatever I want with it. So when it comes to a financial debt, that's an agreement between us. I can forgo that agreement. I can forgive it. I can give it up. So here as well, the Torah obligates a husband to feed and clothe his wife. That's an interpersonal financial obligation that the Torah puts on the husband. If the wife agrees to forgo that debt and say, you don't have to feed me and clothe me, I can look after myself, so then she can do that. That's Reb Meir's reasoning.
Okay.
Which that reasoning is actually so strong, you have to look back at sorry, that's Rabbi Yehuda's reasoning. So Reb Meir, who says you can't do that. Why not?
I see a logic to that, because it just says she has the means to fend for herself. Then fair enough. Then she might have more money than the man even. So shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah. So we'll have to see that. So exactly. So we'll have to see. We'll have to explain why does Reb Meir not allow even the financial stuff. That we'll have to see. Well, and the Gemara it'll come through the lines as we go on. Okay. So now, if you recall, how do we get into this particular discussion? We started off with Rav and Shmuel, who had a disagreement about where a seller says to the buyer, I'm selling you this on condition that you have no claim of trickery of overcharging on me. Rav says that doesn't work. You can't make such a condition against the Torah, and therefore he still can make a claim of trickery, the buyer. Whereas Shmuel says no, it works. That agreement works. If you make such a condition, the seller can have no claim. The Gemara is now saying, well, have a look at this argument between Reb Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Isn't it exactly the same thing? Aren't they having the exact same argument? Whether you can make a condition on a financial transaction that goes against what the Torah says you should do. So says the Gemara, is this not so basically lema, should we not say, like, this is how we introduce this, should we not say that Rav's opinion, who says when you make such a condition against the Torah, it doesn't work? That's exactly like Rabbi Meir, who says you can't make such a condition in the case of the wife. And when Shmuel, in the case of trickery, says you can make the condition, it works, it's a financial deal, is that not exactly the same as Rabbi Yehuda, who says, as far as the financial elements between a husband and a wife, you can make a condition to exempt yourself from those obligations? Is that not exactly the same? Is Shmuel not exactly the same as Rabbi Yehuda?
Do you mind if I ask a question? I missed the beginning of the shiur. Trickery is so. Is it not laid out before the seller, the buyer? Pardon me. It was not laid out that if it's trickery, it's trickery. He doesn't know what he's getting himself into.
So the Torah says that if somebody sells something and overcharges more than a sixth of the retail price, the buyer can come back when he realizes and say, I want my money back. You've overcharged me. Here the debate was, what if the seller said, I'm making condition, I'm selling you this on condition that you cannot come back with any claims, no returns, that's my condition. The question is, can he make such a condition, even though the Torah says he can have a claim? Can he make a condition like that? Rav says no, Shmuel says yes, which is exactly the same as, can the husband make a condition that I'm not paying you my dues, I'm not giving you food and clothing, which Rabbi Meir says can't make such a condition, and Rabbi Yehuda says you can. Seems like exactly the same argument all over again, which is not comfortable. It's not comfortable for Rav and Shmuel, rabbis of the Gemara times, to be repeating an argument that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir already had. So what the Gemara now is going to try to do to avert that is to say that no, Rav and Shmuel, each of them will justify their position according to both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Both Rav and Shmuel, who are the later sages in the Gemara, will say, we're very aware of this brisa, we're very aware of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda's opinions, and Rav says, I am talking according to both opinions. Both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda would agree with me, says Rav. And Shmuel is going to say the same thing. No. Both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda would agree with me. Right? I haven't said what they said yet, but I'm just setting up the structure of what we're going to look at now. That now, in order to avert the idea that Rav and Shmuel are repeating a debate, that Rav is taking one side of the debate, Rabbi Meir's side, and Shmuel is taking Rabbi Yehuda's side, that's not fitting. Rav and Shmuel should not be taking sides in a debate that was debated earlier by earlier sages. They shouldn't just be repeating another debate. So Rav says, no, I'm not arguing against what Rabbi Yehuda said. In fact, Rabbi Yehuda would agree with me. And he'll try and prove that. Shmuel says, no, I'm not arguing against what Rabbi Meir said in the Mishnah. Rabbi Meir would agree with me. So in other words, Rav and Shmuel, their debate includes a debate on the understanding of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda's opinions.
But are we saying that both of Rav and Shmuel will each say that Rav Meir and Rav Yehuda agree with them respectively, or are they saying I
Correct.
go with one and I go with one?
No, because you can't go with one, because then you're repeating the same debate.
Repetition. So they're each going to say
They're each going to say that, no, you think I'm disagreeing with him? I'm not. He would agree with me. He would agree with my opinion. Let's have a look. This is where you have to hold. You have to remember names. If you're not good at names, it's not going to work. You have to remember, Rav said that you can't make a condition against the Torah even in financial issues. Shmuel said you can make a condition against the Torah in financial issues. Then that was in the Gemara. In the Brisa, Rabbi Meir said that you cannot make a condition even in financial issues, against what the Torah says. Rabbi Yehuda says you can make, when it's financial, you can make a condition against what the Torah says. So Rav seemed to be the same as Reb Meir, and Shmuel seemed to be the same as Rabbi Yehuda. Let's see how they tell us, no, that's not true. Bottom line of the page, Amalach Rav. Rav will tell you. Rav, who said that you cannot make a condition against what the Torah says in financial issues. The Amre Afilul Rabbi Yehuda. He says, my opinion even fits in with Rabbi Yehuda, who says you can make a condition in the case of the marriage against what the Torah says about financial issues. How could Rav's opinion fit in with Rabbi Yehuda? Because Rav says, let me explain to you Rabbi Yehuda's logic. Ad kan lo kama Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda only said that you're allowed to make a condition that contradicts the Torah. Hassam, in that case of the wife, Eladiyoda v'kamachla. He only said it in that case because in the case of the wife, she heard exactly what she's getting into. She knew she's losing financial support, and she accepted it. Why did Rabbi Yehuda say that you're allowed to make a condition? The husband can say, I'm marrying you on condition that you're not getting your food and your clothing. Rabbi Yehuda said that the part about intimacy doesn't work, but the food and clothing works. Why? Because the wife knew exactly what she was getting into. She knew that I am not getting fed and I'm not getting clothes. There was a clear and certain loss she was taking, and she knew and she accepted it. In such a case, we say, well, if both parties accept, they know what they're getting into, she knows she's losing. She knows exactly what she's losing. That's fine. That's where Rabbi Yehuda said his thing. However, over the page, Aval. However, Hacha, in my case of the buyer and the seller, Miyada Demachil, did the buyer know for a fact that he was being ripped off so we can say that he's overlooking that? No. In our case, the buyer didn't know he was being ripped off. The seller was saying, you can't have a claim, no returns. Does that mean he's being overcharged? No, maybe not. Maybe he's not being overcharged. Just the seller saying, this is my condition, this is my policy, you can't return, you can't claim that you've been overcharged. So in the buyer's mind, does he know I've just been ripped off and I'm accepting it? No. He said, okay, I'm accepting that condition because maybe I'm not being ripped off. And so that the buyer is not knowingly accepting a loss there. And so in such a case, in my case as Rav, Rabbi Yehuda would agree with me that there, the condition doesn't work because the buyer thinks he doesn't know that he's being ripped off. So you can't say that he's overlooking his loss. Oh, this is interesting. Let's explain it. Let's go into this again. What Rav is saying is, I agree at 100% that there are times when you can make a condition against what the Torah says. Rabbi Yehuda's example is a great example. Rabbi Yehuda's example was where a husband says to a wife, I'm getting married to you on condition that I'm not paying for your clothes, your food, and I'm not being intimate. That were the conditions. What did Rabbi Yehuda say about that? The intimacy, that condition you can't make. But the monetary things, when it comes to monetary things, you can forgive a debt. It's okay to forgive a debt. Even if the Torah says you have to pay a debt, you can forgive it. So here, the Torah says a husband has to pay for the wife's food and clothing. The wife can agree to forgo that. But when can you make such a condition? When the wife knows what she's losing, it's clear, it's upfront, this is what I'm losing. She's aware, and she says, I willingly and knowingly forgive. I overlook, I forgive the debt. You don't have to pay for my food and clothing. That, Rav says, I'm fine with that. That's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. I'm fine with that. I'll tell you what my condition is, my situation is, Rav says, the situation I'm talking about, Rabbi Yehuda would agree with me. Because my situation is where the buyer doesn't know that he's being ripped off. He's assuming he's not being ripped off. When he agrees to this condition, he says, okay, there are certain sellers who their condition is no returns. You can't come and claim that I've overcharged you. Take it or leave it. That doesn't mean he's ripping me off. That's his policy. He doesn't want to bother with returns. But maybe he's not ripping me off. When the buyer agreed to that, is he consciously being ripped off and saying, I don't mind being ripped off? When you go into a shop and the shop says no returns, are you saying in your mind what that means is that they're selling me junk? No. You're saying, okay, that's the policy. So you can't come and tell me in this case when the seller says you can't have any claim against me. Even Rabbi Yehuda would agree with me, says Rav. Rav says he'd agree with me that does not work because the buyer is not conscious, he's not aware, he's not forgiving the being ripped off. He doesn't know that he's being ripped off. Only later, when he goes home and he shows to his neighbor what he bought, and the neighbor says, what'd you pay for that? What? You paid that? That's a total ripoff. That's not the price. Only then he realizes he's ripped off. And he comes back to the seller and says, you ripped me off. Give me my money back. And the seller says, but you accepted the condition. And he says, I accepted. I didn't know I was being ripped off. I didn't forgive you the debt. The Torah says you can't do such a thing. So Rav says, Rabbi Yehuda, that's how Rabbi Yehuda would agree. He would agree with me. Only in his case does he say the condition works because the wife knew what she was getting into. You can forgive a debt. But in my case, the buyer didn't know what he was getting into. He thought he was getting a fair deal. Only later he realized that it was ripped off. Therefore, he never forgave the debt. The buyer never forgave. And if he didn't forgive, accepting the condition doesn't work because the condition is against what the Torah says.
What if the buyer knew, for example, it's the last item, and he knows he's not buying it, he's buying it at more than 1/6 of the price. So he knows he's getting ripped off, but he wants to have the item.
Well, then why is he coming back with a claim?
Maybe he has second thoughts, or he's that doesn't work.
If we know he's accepted and he's forgiven and he knows the facts, that's different. Then it's the same as the woman who's getting married. She knows what she's getting into.
Right. Yeah.
But we have no reason to assume that. We have no reason to assume. In the case of the woman, she knows that he's not giving her food and clothing. That's outright. That's it's stuff that she is owed, and she's forgiven.
It's not like an informed consent. It's not.
In this case, the buyer is not owed the money, and he's forgiving it. He thinks it's a fair deal. It's only later that he may realize when he agreed to the deal, he wasn't forgiving anything. You don't assume that he's forgiving anything.
So, is Rav saying that Rav is saying that according to Rav Yehuda, you can only make a condition if it's certain that it's going to eventuate, basically.
Yeah, when there's right up front, there is a loss that is being forgiven. There is a debt that is being forgiven right up front. So when the person who agrees to the condition there's clear money that's owed to me, and I'm saying I'm giving that up. Okay, well, if you give it up, you have a right to give up a debt. That Rav says I can handle that. I can handle that. That you give up a debt. My case is not that. My case is where the buyer doesn't think he has a debt. The buyer thought he bought fair and square. It was a decent price. So therefore, when he accepted the condition, he wasn't forgiving a debt. What he was doing was he was agreeing for a Torah law to be overridden, which you can't do. So you get what I'm saying? There's a nuance here in the agreement. Is the agreement that I owe you money and I want you to forgive the debt? Or is the agreement there's a Torah law that I want you to override? In the case of the wife, the husband is telling the wife, there's money I owe you. You know I owe you, and I know I owe you, and I want you to forgive it. So for that part, fine. For the monetary part, she can forgive. For the intimacy part, she can't. That's a Torah law. That's not a financial debt. But for the money, she can. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says.
But why isn't the money part of Torah law as well? For example, Misa, right? If we say, I'm obligated to tzedakah, you can't just excuse someone's obligation just because they're financial. If they're also form part of Torah law.
So, no, tzedakah is not a debt that you owe a particular person. There's a mitzvah for you to separate tzedakah, to give to the poor. So the poor man can't say, I forgive it. Because what about the other poor man? He doesn't forgive it. There's another poor man who doesn't forgive it.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So there, that's not a debt that can be forgiven. But if an individual owes an individual money, he can say, I forgive it. Let's say someone stole from another person, and for that you have to pay them double.
Right. Or damages.
The person says, I forgive it. Well, it's a debt that he owes you. If you want to forgive it, you can forgive it. Just like if he gives it to you, you could give it back to him. You could refund him. You can forgive a debt, even though the Torah says he has to pay double, but it's money.
Mm-hmm. But I don't know if this is what Vitaly was coming at, but the concept that a person's money is, they have their money in order to distribute accordingly. Hashem puts a person's money in the hand as predetermined, right? And that's not really your money. It's the money that you've got a right to manage and take ownership of and properly distribute, right? So is it yours or is it Hashem's to forgive a debt? You know what I mean? So is that
it's just like it's yours to spend money, to give money, to invest money. Hashem has entrusted you to do that. So you can be entrusted to forgive the money and say, forgive the debt. You don't have to pay me. It's fine. That's up to you. You have the right to do that, just like you have the right to spend the money. You have the right to forgive a debt. You can lend money. You can refund money.
The law of Onah is also towards the woman. What if she, for some bizarre reason, says you don't owe that to me?
That's not money. It's not monetary. And so, even though she can, on an individual basis, she could say,
I forgive. Well, I forgive you.
But then that's her. But when she doesn't forgive, he can't come and say, yeah, we agreed. We agreed that you forgave that role. No, it's still her right. She has the right to demand anytime. So do you see how Rav has completely wiggled out of this? We said, Rav, you agree with Rabbi Meir, but you disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. How can you disagree with Rabbi Yehuda from the Mishnah? Rav says, I don't. Rabbi Yehuda and I get on very well. You can easily justify Rabbi Yehuda's opinion according to mine. Rabbi Yehuda said that the debt is forgiven, that the condition does work for monetary value, things between a husband and wife. Why? Because the wife has a debt that she's forgiving. Whereas the buyer and the seller are different in my case. The buyer doesn't know he has a debt, so he forgave nothing. And therefore, the condition was saying the Torah law should not apply. When you go home and realize you're ripped off, the Torah law should not kick in. You can't say such a condition, and Rabbi Yehuda would agree with me.
So could you say that Rav is arguing that Rav Yehuda would say that because you don't know if that damage or debt is going to eventuate, it's as if almost that condition kind of never sort of, if the condition never comes into play, then it's kind of not relevant if that it was there in the first place. So therefore, you're permitted to make that kind of a condition.
No, he says you can't make that a condition. You can't make the condition if it's not relevant now, then he's not forgiving a debt now. So in the case of the buyer, when he bought the object and he agreed to the condition, what was that agreement? Agreeing to the condition that you cannot have a claim of trickery on me. You can't claim that I overpaid you. What is he agreeing to? He's not saying, you know what? You actually owe me money. You seller owe me money because I paid you too much money, but I'm forgiving the money that I paid you. No, he's not saying that. What he's saying is, I think it's a fair deal. At the moment, I'm happy with the deal. That's why I'm buying. What I'm foregoing is the right to come back to you and use the Torah law that says that overcharging has to be returned. That's what he's foregoing. You can't forego that. You can forego a debt, but the buyer doesn't think he has a debt. So therefore, he can't forego a Torah law, a right that he has that the Torah gave him. Gotcha? What Rav has done is he's showed how Rabbi Yehuda, who you thought disagrees with me, no, he agrees with me. He can agree with me totally. In his case, he says that the condition works because the wife was owed money, she's forgiving a debt. In my case, the condition doesn't work because the buyer at the time of buying didn't think he was owed any money, so he wasn't forgiving any debt. What was he doing by agreeing to this? He was agreeing to a Torah law being suspended. You can't agree to that. You can't have Torah laws suspended. So Rav says the condition doesn't work in my case, but Rabbi Yehuda would agree that it doesn't work in my case.
So if you know at the time the condition is made that it's a monetary thing, then you know it has a monetary value. But if the thing may not eventuate,
if the later on the Gemara says, if the seller said, I'm selling you $100 thing for $200, but you can't complain. If he said that, you have no redress. You can't complain. It's worth $100. I'm selling for $200 because I know that's the only one you can get. It's the only one around. You need it right now, but no returns. So it's all clear. In that case, the buyer is saying, I'm basically forgiving you $100 extra that I'm paying. I'm forgiving it. I'm forgiving the debt. If I agree to that, I'm agreeing to it.
It's the same case with the wife.
That would be like the wife, where the wife is saying, I know I'm owed food and clothing. I'm forgiving you that debt. That's different. But that's not the case that Rav's talking about. Rav's talking about a normal buying and selling, where the buyer thinks he got a decent deal, and the seller says, no returns, you can't have a claim on me of overcharging. He agrees to it because he thinks, okay, I'm fine. I'm not gonna, I don't need that. Later, when he realized he was ripped off and he wants to come back, the seller says, but you agreed. The buyer says, but the Torah says I'm allowed to do this. I didn't know at the time. I wasn't forgiving you a debt because I didn't know I was being overcharged. Now I realize I'm overcharged. The Torah law kicks in that you have to refund me. And Rav says he's right. The Torah law cannot be overridden by a condition. Now we have to reverse our brains to hear Shmuel argue the exact opposite. Shmuel, remember, in the case of trickery, of overcharging, says that when a condition is made by the seller that you cannot have any claim against me that I've overcharged you, and the buyer agrees and accepts that, says Shmuel, it works. The condition works. How could Shmuel fit in with Reb Meir's opinion? Because Reb Meir in the Brisa said that when the husband makes the condition for monetary as well as intimacy, he says, I'm not going to feed you, I'm not going to give you clothing, and I'm not going to give you intimacy. Reb Meir says all three conditions are out the window. He can't make those conditions. He has to give her food, clothing, and intimacy. They're married and the conditions are erased. How could Shmuel justify that opinion? Shmuel is the one who said that you're allowed to make a condition. Certainly in monetary issues, you can make a condition that's standing, because Shmuel's example was the case of trickery. The buyer says, I'm selling you this on condition you have no claim against me for trickery of overcharging. Says Shmuel, the buyer has no claim. It's standing. How does Shmuel justify himself according to Reb Meir's opinion? So listen to this. Ushmuel Amar, top of the page. Ushmuel Amar, what does Shmuel say? My opinion fits perfectly, even with Reb Meir. Reb Meir would agree with what I'm saying. Why? Reb Meir is the one who said that you can't make a condition even on financial things. The husband's conditions that I'm not going to feed and clothe do not apply. He has to feed and clothe her. I'll tell you why, says Shmuel. Ad kan lo kama Reb Meir. Reb Meir, who says that the condition is thrown out of the water, even the financial conditions that I'm not going to feed and clothe my wife, even they don't apply. Reb Meir is only saying that hasam ela devade ka'akar. It's only in that case because there is definitely going to be an uprooting of Torah law here. There is no doubt that it's going to happen. When the husband said to the wife, I'm marrying you on condition that you have no claim of food, clothing, or intimacy from me. We know from get-go that the Torah law that says that a husband has to feed, clothe, and be intimate with his wife is going to be abrogated. The condition from its very inception there is definitely uprooting what the Torah says. Reb Meir says you cannot do that. Aval hacha, but in my case, says Shmuel, where the seller says to the buyer, I'm selling you on condition that you can have no claim of trickery against me. Who says that a Torah law is uprooted? Maybe there's no trickery here. Let's hear Shmuel's brilliant argument again. Shmuel says that in the case of a man selling an object, a seller selling to a buyer, where the seller says, I'm selling you on condition that you can have no claim of trickery against me. I know the Torah says that if I overcharge you more than a 6, you can get your money back. I know that says that. I'm making a condition, no returns. You take it, and that's it. That's my condition. Shmuel says the condition stands. You're allowed to do that. That's Shmuel, which fits nicely with Rabbi Yehuda, who says that when a husband says to a wife, I'm marrying you on condition that you cannot claim from me food, clothing, or intimacy, the intimacy part, well, he has to fulfill, but the food and clothing, a monetary agreement, she agreed, so he doesn't have to give her. Shmuel agrees nicely with Rabbi Yehuda, but Rabbi Meir, who said that those 3 conditions are all thrown out the window, even the food and the clothing, he has to give her. You can't make a condition against what the Torah says, that a husband has to give food and clothing as well as intimacy. How could Shmuel's opinion fit in with Rabbi Meir? Says Shmuel, I'll tell you. Do you know why Rabbi Meir said that you cannot make a condition in monetary issues? It's a monetary thing. It's an agreement between 2 people. It's money that's owed. The Torah says that a husband owes his wife food and clothing. Why can't the wife say, it's fine, I forgive you? Why? Because in that case, there is a definite thing owed here. It is definite. The Torah has an obligation for the husband to feed the wife. The wife needs to eat. That's definitely going to happen. The wife needs to wear clothing. It's definitely going to happen. If the husband does not feed her and does not clothe her, he's gone against what the Torah said. The condition was, it was a definite thing that was going to happen. You have to feed her and clothe your wife. That was a definite debt that was going to be, and he averted that. You can't do that. You can't make such a condition. There, Reb Meir says, I disallow even a financial agreement. You can't make a condition against the Torah when you're definitely uprooting what the Torah says. The Torah says, feed and clothe your wife. And you're saying, I'm not going to. But, says Shmuel, Reb Meir would agree in our case, where a seller says to a buyer, I'm selling you this object on condition that you can't come back with a claim of trickery. I know the Torah says that you can, but I'm saying you can't. And the buyer agrees. There, says Shmuel, Reb Meir would agree that is okay. Do you know why? Because it's not a definite uprooting of a Torah law, because there may not be any trickery here in the first place. The deal might be a fair deal. The buyer may go home, show his neighbor, and the neighbor will say, how much did you pay for that? And he tells him, he says, oh, that's a good deal. Well done. It might be a fair price. As long as the condition, says Shmuel, Rabbi Meir would agree with me that as long as the condition is not inevitably breaking the Torah, it's not inevitably going against the Torah law, it's not inevitably uprooting a Torah law. So then in such a case, when it's financial, even Rabbi Meir would agree the condition works. When does Rabbi Meir say that the condition, even a financial condition, does not work? When it is inevitably uprooting a Torah law. So in other words, what Shmuel here is giving us a bit more of a refined view of Reb Meir's logic. That why can you not make a condition in a financial issue against what the Torah says? Why does Reb Meir hold that? We know Rabbi Yehuda says you can. You can forgive a debt. Why does Reb Meir disagree? Well, he only disagrees, says Shmuel, he only disagrees where the words you're saying are inevitably going to clash with the Torah law. There's an inevitable train crash happening here. Your condition is going this way, the Torah law is going this way, and they are going to crash. It's going to happen. Those words, when you say words of a condition that must contradict the Torah, the words disappear because we can't have the Torah crashing into anything. So when you made a condition that a husband says to his wife to be, that I'm marrying you on condition that I'm not paying for your food and your clothing, and I'm not giving you intimacy. Says Reb Meir, of course, the intimacy condition is out the window. You can't make a condition that's not financial. But even the financial conditions, I'm not going to give you food and clothing, are out the window. The conditions don't work, says Reb Meir. You know why? Because that is a debt that is going to happen. That is money that is owed. That is inevitable that you have to pay for your wife's food and clothing. By you saying, I'm not going to, you are making an inevitable train crash between your condition and what the Torah says you're supposed to do. That can't be. However, says Shmuel, my case was where a seller said to a buyer, I'm selling you this on condition that you can't have a claim of trickery on me. So you're going to say, well, the Torah says a person who was overcharged can have a claim. The seller here is saying, you cannot have a claim against me. That's not an inevitable crash because maybe there is no claim. Maybe he's not overcharging. And as long as the condition could coexist with what the Torah says, because the condition is you can't have a claim of trickery on me. Maybe there's no claim of trickery. Maybe there really is no claim of trickery. Maybe there's no trickery. Therefore, it's not inevitable, the train crash here. So says Shmuel, Reb Meir would say that condition is all right. You can make a monetary condition, you can forgive a monetary debt if that condition is not inevitably going to break a Torah law, going to contradict the Torah law.
So as long as you can introduce an element of a suffix, a doubt.
Yes.
They seem to agree.
Yes, because if it might not ever happen, so then the condition's not uprooted from its core, because it may never have happened. And therefore, the condition stands. And even if, says Shmuel, even if the buyer later goes home and finds out that he was overcharged, the condition took root, he accepted a condition, and that means he's forgiven the debt. He can't go back with a claim, says Shmuel. In other words, maybe putting it differently. If when you said the words of the condition, it immediately contradicted a Torah obligation. The husband says, I'm not giving you food and clothing. Where the obligation, as soon as he gets married, he's obligated to give her food and clothing. There's a collision there. The words collided straight away. So that condition is out the window, says Shmuel. But when the words were said, if that condition is not colliding with Torah law, he says, you cannot have a claim of trickery on me. Maybe there's no claim of trickery and there never will be. It's not inevitable that those words are going to have to be eaten. So therefore, the words took root. The condition actually worked. And even if down the track there is a claim of trickery, the condition applies and therefore you can't have a claim, says Shmuel. And Reb Meir would agree with me. Reb Meir, in his case, said you can't make a condition against the Torah because the condition contradicted Torah from the very beginning. It inevitably caused a clash between the Torah and the condition. But in my case, Reb Meir would agree the condition landed at a time when it's not inevitably going to break the Torah law, and therefore the condition stands. Reb Meir would agree with me, says Shmuel. So with absolute genius and total mind-bending logic, we managed to hear two opinions that seemed exactly the same in two cases, and both of those opinions were able to be reconciled with both of the opinions in the other case. Rav could say both Reb Meir and Rabbi Yehuda agree with me, and Shmuel said no, they could both agree with me, and therefore the argument between Rav and Shmuel is a valid argument, because even though Rabbi Yehuda and Reb Meir already had the argument, but Rav and Shmuel disagree on what they meant, on how far their opinions go. And so therefore, Rav and Shmuel is a new argument, is an extension of their argument. And just for the sake of closure, the halacha goes like Rav. The halacha follows Rav, and that is that when you make a condition in a sale, in a case of a sale, you make a condition that I don't want the law of trickery. The seller says, you can't use the law of trickery against me. He still can. He still can make the law, the claim of trickery. It doesn't work. All right. All right.
Thank you.
I think we should leave that there. I hope your brains are ticking now and you won't be able to sleep for a while at least.
Revision for sure.
Then you have a good sleep.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you
Thank
so
you. It
much.
was fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rabbi Moss.
Thank you. Have a great night.